Good morning. Welcome to Tea, Coffee, and Torah, episode 26. I'm glad to have you with me this morning. We have some fun information to cover. And it's fun because we get to see synthesis. We get to see how things connect together. This particular series, which we started 2 episodes ago, is regarding prophet scholarship in the Old Testament or Tanakh. And what we're going to see as this series unfolds is how every single prophet quotes from the Torah. Sometimes it's direct words. Other times it is going to be paraphrasing. They put it in their own words. Sometimes they will simply reiterate a concept. But it is a concept that we only find in the Torah, or rather it originates in the Torah. We've also seen that Jeremiah does quote a text that is outside of the current book of Deuteronomy as we have it in scripture today. And, so this does lead credence to the other books of the Pentateuch or the Old Testament, Chumash, whatever you want to call it, the Torah. This does lead credence. So previously we've seen that Jeremiah quotes from Leviticus 26:13. Now, I am going to try to put these on one place. I will probably end up putting these on my page, which is jodelonstott.com. And this is the first one that we did. This was the Leviticus 26:13, where we show that Jeremiah quotes exact words of I have broken your yoke and burst your bands. 2 of those words are direct quotes or direct words. And then the third is a synonym, but the concept is the same. We also find that a concept where in this text, Jeremiah 2:20 is what we looked at, where it says, you said, I will not work or serve. It really can mean either way in context. And that is a direct quote from either Exodus 20, verse 5, Exodus 19, verses 7, 8. So you find that there is this direct quote where Jeremiah is actually quoting a text outside of Deuteronomy. Now, we are looking at today, again, if you decide to print this, and I reposted it again this morning, I printed it in leaves. I printed on portrait, and it comes out to 3 leaves that I just put side by side. And this really allows you to kind of see the concepts as they progress through the text. So what we're looking at is Jeremiah states, and I'm in a land that was not sown. Now, Jeremiah's exhortation, where it says, I remember you. This is referring to something previous in Israel's history. It is something referring to something older. And the Hebrew word here is zakar. We saw in Jeremiah 2:20, Jeremiah used the term from forever and indicated that he was actually quoting from an ancient text. And the word there was mit olam, meaning from forever. And then Jeremiah gives a direct quote. Here, Jeremiah is paraphrasing. Now, last time we looked in episode 25, we looked at how Israel covenants with Yahweh. This is a love experience. This is entering into a specific marriage contract between God and Israel. And in Deuteronomy 7:7-10, it says, Yahweh says, I set my love upon you. So, and in return, Israel is admonished, encouraged to love God back with all her heart, mind, and soul. And the way that she shows this is by keeping God's instructions, by keeping his commandments. Now, we're going to continue in this because in Jeremiah 2:28, he refers to this wedding experience, this covenant experience occurring in the wilderness. So if we continue with Jeremiah 2, verse 2:2, it says that you went after me in the wilderness in a land that was not sown. Now, in Hebrew, when a point is stressed, it's always expressed 2 times. Now, Jeremiah expresses this first with the concept of wilderness, but then he reiterates this land was not sown. So if it's not sown, then it means it's dry, it's parched. It is something where Israel, there's no vegetation. So it would have been a very arid climate. Now, we find that this idea of Israel being in the wilderness is reiterated in Exodus 5:3, where it says, "And they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us go, that we pray you, 3 days' journey into the desert, and sacrifice there unto Yahweh our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." This is reiterated again in Exodus 19, verse 2. "For they were departed from Rephidim, and were come into the desert of Sinai, and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mount." Let me grab a little cup of tea this morning. Very good on a cold day. So again, there's this idea of wilderness throughout at the book of Exodus. It occurs again in Deuteronomy 2:1. "When we turned and we took our journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea, as Yahweh spoke unto me, we compassed Mount Seir many days." Again, Exodus 14:11. "And they said unto Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Therefore have you dealt with us to carry us forth out of the land of Egypt." And then Numbers 1 verse 1. "Yahweh spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of the congregation." So you find that this idea of Israel being in the wilderness and kind of their origins as a nation, their foundation of a nation, really begins in the wilderness with this covenant experience. Now, for me, I'm trying to be very logically minded. The first question that I have is, how does a big group of people end up in a wilderness that is virtually kind of unsustainable? Yes, the desert can sustain some small tribes, but it cannot sustain a large population. So how did Israel get there? So again, I think some of you guys know what I'm getting to, but we'll get into that next week. For this, I want to show you that it's so fascinating, because this wilderness experience becomes something that all the prophets refer to. It is the foundation for every thought and idea. There's an adage that we have modernly that is very scriptural. It meets you can't even consider being a prophet in Israel unless you understand this one principle. And that is, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. And the first rule in prophet scholarship, this is the scholarship of the prophets, is they have to become very well versed and have a very strong foundation in ancient history. The past is repetitive. It may repeat with different specifics, with different parameters, with different facets when it does repeat, but the overall aggregate history is cyclical. It repeats. As long as humanity does not turn from sin, as long as we keep seeking our own way and we don't follow that marriage covenant that, believe it or not, is eventually open for all nations. It's not necessarily, even though it begins exclusively for Israel, there's a caveat to this that we'll see later on as our study progresses. So with the covenant with Israel, it is something that it is foundational concept that you find in every single prophet. So when we are looking at ideas that would have been organic and original to a Torah document, we find that Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Hosea all quote from and reiterate concepts of God's marriage with Israel in the wilderness. So now let's go to Jeremiah 31, verse 32. And if you hear some whining in the background, my son let out our dog, and he likes to whine a lot. I think he's wanting me to pet him. So if you hear a little bit of whining, that's what it is. Jeremiah 31, verse 32. If you'll go there, or if you have this handy little chart, just refer to it. I'm going to quote from this because it's very fascinating how Israel's prophets take the past and then they reissue it for the future. So the past actually becomes the future. And this is what Jeremiah 31 verse 32 states. It says, "Not according to the covenant that I made with your fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenants they always broke, even though I was a husband to them, says Yahweh." So again, we have this idea that Israel entered into a marriage covenant. This marriage covenant took place in the wilderness. And from that point forward, Yahweh considered himself Israel's husband. Again, this was expressed in Jeremiah 2:2, where it says, the espousals when you went after me in the wilderness. Now, we're going to go to Isaiah 55 verses 5, and this does continue into verse 6. I didn't quote it, but if you want to look at verse 6, it says, for your maker is your husband, Yahweh of hosts is his name. So again, we have this idea that Yahweh is Israel's husband. Now, Hosea is the other one that builds on this concept even more than Jeremiah. And the reason I'm starting with Jeremiah is that Jeremiah is late. It is usually considered among scholars, especially those that base solely and exclusively on the documentary hypothesis, that Jeremiah only accepted the book of Deuteronomy. What I am trying to show is that based on Jeremiah's words and the text that he specifically quotes from or refers to, maybe it's a concept he reiterates, those parts at least of those books we can't rule out. And we're going to build and build, and hopefully through this series we'll see, well, should the entire books be accepted? Because when you have probably about 80% of the book being referred to, it does indeed lead credence to the documents that we have today, even though they've been edited, even though we do have a lot of colophons, things from later scribes that have been placed in the text. It doesn't necessarily undermine that original text that is there. So let's go to Hosea 2, verses 14 through 17. And notice how Hosea's words really parallel the concepts that are reiterated in Jeremiah 31, verses 32. It says, therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably to her. And I will give her vineyards from there and the valley of Achor for a door of hope. And she shall sing there as in the days of her youth. Again, this is the idea that this is long in the past. And in the days when she came forth up out of the land of Egypt. Okay, so Israel ends up in the wilderness. Where does she come from? She comes from up out of the land of Egypt. And it shall be in that day, says Yahweh, that you shall call me Ishi, and you shall no more call me Bali. And the word for Ishi here is man or my husband. It says, for I will take the names of Balaam out of her mouth, and they shall no more be remembered by their name. So this is referring to Israel's original covenant experience, but Hosea uses this in the concept of something that God is going to do again. Yahweh is going to again allure Israel into the wilderness. He's going to again court her and seek to make a new covenant with her. Now we're going to get back to Jeremiah's covenant where it says not like the previous covenant. We're just going to touch on that. I don't want to attract from the discussion of prophet scholarship in ancient Israel, but we will come back to that in just a moment. So now scope down to Hosea 2 verses 18 through 20. It says, and in that day I will make a covenant with them, with the beasts of the field, and with the fowls of heaven, and with the creeping things of the ground. And I will break the bow and the sword of the battle out of the earth, and I will make them to lie down safely. Now, I don't know if you guys have noticed it, but the idea that Hosea is expressing coincides with both Micah and Isaiah, where they states that Israel will beat their swords into plowshares, and they will not learn to do war anymore. So this is referring to a time of peace. And this is why you will see Jeremiah and other prophets in ancient Israel referring to Israel's new covenant, the covenant that God will make with Israel in the future, as being specifically a covenant of peace. Now, there are several people in ancient Israel's history who were given covenants of peace. David was one. Pinchas was another. But there are other people that we'll get into later on that also had Yahweh's covenants of peace. But the nation of Israel never had this covenant of peace. Originally, they had what is termed, and this is what Jeremiah is referring to, they had what was termed to as a fire covenant. This was a covenant of refining. And you especially see this in Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26, what I term the prophetic code, where it states that if Israel will violate the terms of the covenant, these calamities, these disasters will come upon Israel. And this future covenant will not have those specific parameters, because Israel will actually have a new heart, a new mind, and Israel will actually be brought to the point of obedience. Ezekiel talks about this. I will give them in Ezekiel 36, I will give them a new heart, a new spirit I will put within you. And this is a heart and spirit of obedience. The Torah is written in our hearts that we actually do it. And the specific ways in which this new covenant of peace differs from the old is specifically in terms of judgment. It is in terms of the things that Israel will go through. People want to lump the idea of this ancient marriage compact into one aggregate thing and just say, oh, the old covenant's done away with. And that is not accurate. When you study, and if you look at Yahweh Exists Volume 1 in Chapter 3, I show that throughout history, every single covenant that Yahweh makes with Israel, it always, and I mean always, incorporates the previous covenant. Never once does it rescind a stipulation, a regulation, or a promise of a previous covenant. The only thing that we do find will change when it comes to this new covenant will be the judgments, will be, the consequences. It's going to be a lot more lenient, but it can be lenient because Israel's going to be more obedient. You can't have leniency unless there's great obedience. But in an era where there's great obedience, you can have great peace, great harmony. And then when there is error, you can really have other means than just, historically, in the old covenant, it talks about in Deuteronomy 28, I will send beasts upon your land to deprive you of your children. The other caveat with the new covenant is that Yahweh will never again use deportation as a means of judging Israel. So we'll get into that in another session, because that is really an entirely different discussion. I do want to study and focus specifically on prophet scholarship and what they quoted. So let's go back to Hosea 2, and we're going to pick up again in verse 19. It says, and I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you unto me in righteousness and in judgment and in loving kindness and in mercies. So here we have all the ideas that exhibit a covenant of peace. I will even betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. Now this phrase, you shall know that I am Yahweh, becomes really the theme of Ezekiel. Ezekiel quotes this phrase more than any other prophet. But what I want to show today is this idea of betrothal. Hosea is taking something that occurred anciently, something that occurred with Israel in the wilderness when they came up out of Egypt, and Yahweh made this marriage contract with ancient Israel. And every prophet reiterates this idea. So when we read the Pentateuch, when we read Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, the story of Yahweh marrying Israel is an original concept. It is something that very much is original to Israel's foundational history. And the fact that Jeremiah says that Yahweh remembers this, it's appealing to something that's very old and very ancient. And when you have an ancient text that is rehearsed in the ears of the children, that the Levites teach, that is disseminated throughout society, it does indeed become a collective memory. It becomes something that is ingrained in society. And I do compare this idea, the history of the Exodus, with signs and wonders and an outstretched hand, which we're going to get into next week, as being a foundational concept to ancient Israel's history, to their idea of nationhood. So that's where I'm going to leave it today. I encourage you to just look through this, meditate on these ideas and see what you think. Don't rely on my word for it, but you are so much stronger when you do the research yourself. And eventually I am going to show, I have to get my computer stuff worked up a little bit, but I am going to do a screen share, and I'm going to show you guys tools on the internet where you can do these studies and you can research it for yourselves. Because the more that you do your own research, the more that you build your concepts and your ideology for yourself, and you're not relying on anybody else, the sooner you're going to fulfill that divine commission where each of us can become messiahs. And guess what? When we each fulfill that role of becoming messiahs, then we become a people that is strong, cannot be led astray. And then Yahweh is really put in a place where he has something to work with. And all those blessings, this covenant of peace that's in the future, can be fulfilled. It can be activated, and it's something that gives us great hope for the present day. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I will see you Monday. Monday we are getting into, let me look at this. We are going to be getting into Jeremiah 32:21. So if you want to study that, there are 7 specific things that Jeremiah refers to that occur in the book of Exodus. Really, Exodus and Deuteronomy is really where it is quoted from. So thank you for joining me, and we will see you next time.